go. All right, here we go. This is the 200 Churches podcast. My name is Jeff Cady. I am here with a special guest tonight. Johnny's in a wonk tonight. He wouldn't even reply to me. I don't know what's going on with Johnny. If you're new to this podcast, Johnny Craig and I are co-hosts of the 200 Churches podcast, and he's not around. So I have dipped into the guest barrel, and out of my ladle came Scott Dalen. Scott will introduce himself in a minute, but tonight he holds the Johnny Craig Chair of Podcasting, the esteemed Johnny Craig Chair of Podcasting, as a special guest. Scott, say hello.
Hey, everybody. It is great to be back, to be here across the digital desk, as Johnny and I have called it in the past, to spend this time with you, Jeff, and to hopefully hold up his high podcast chair standards. That's always my goal.
At least a high voice, right?
Yes, at least the high voice.
Hey, this is season 3, Scott, episode 2. We took literally 8 months off of podcasting and just rolled back into it last week. And so this is season 3, episode 2. And I'm so glad you're on, because I was telling you, we started 9 years ago this month. And 9 years ago, we've had guests on who today, some of those guests have passed away. Others have fallen out of ministry. Others have literally lost their marriages. And some have left. They just kind of left us. And so you were on early on. I don't know what year, but I would say probably 15, maybe
15, 16, somewhere in there.
somewhere around there. And you still
Yep,
serve in the same church.
I am still in the same church. I have been serving Underwood Lutheran. We're a ELCA congregation, one of the branches of the Lutheran Church. I have been here since the middle of 2013. So right about the time that you and Johnny were starting 200 Churches in the first place was when I finished up seminary and was ordained and was called to this church. And I am still here now, pushing 9 years later. So apparently longevity is in my genes.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And we want to provide ministry encouragement to pastors of small churches. That's been our shtick for 9 years now, and I can't think of a better thing to do than provide ministry encouragement. I always tell people that encouragement really is the oxygen of the soul. And when people don't get encouragement, man, they shrivel up. And I'm happy to say that 9 years later, small church pastors, I think, get a lot more encouragement, and the small church gets a lot more respect in the ministry world than it did 9 years ago. Do you agree with that, Scott?
I absolutely agree. For such a long time, everything that we would hear or that we would read, or every anecdote or every article or whatever, was always about the bigwigs, all about the great big ones. And there's nothing wrong with those large, big churches, those mega churches. They serve a need. They serve a type of faith community, and for some, that's what they're attracted to, and that's where they feel spiritually fed, and that's a great thing. But the data is very, very clear that the vast majority of congregations, of faith communities, whatever you want to call them, are small, are 200 or less. You always say give or take 100 or two. Well, if you
Yeah,
take 200, you give or take 200, that would be zero, which would be
yeah,
really small.
exactly.
But yeah, so almost all the faith communities out there are small-ish, and and that's not a bad thing. That's something to be recognized and celebrated within the context of those communities.
So in the past 2 years now, with what our country has gone through, what the world has gone through, ministry has taken some. I think of those loop-de-loop airplanes, that they go, loop after loop after loop after curve after turn after dive. That's what I feel like we've been through. These biplanes at some wacky plane show with all different color smoke coming out of the back of them. And depending on which church, it is, it's whatever color smoke is coming out the back of the pastor's head. but it's just been crazy. It's been really crazy. Do you think it's been harder for pastors of mid-size and larger churches, or do you think it's been harder for pastors of smaller churches, given what we've experienced?
Well, I can only speak to my own experience and what I see, within the circles that I run in. Over the course of the last 4 years, I've been serving in what my denomination calls a synod. It's kind of a geographic region, and but I've been serving on the council of what we call the Western Iowa Synod, kind of the western third of Iowa, and so I'm connected through that with a lot of different sized congregations, some very, very small, to where, it might be 10 or 15 people on a Sunday, up to the largest one within our synod is about 1,800 members. So, a pretty good sized congregation, not a mega church by any means, but larger. And from what I've heard from people and from what I've experienced myself and from conversations that I've had, I think it's been harder for those smaller churches simply because of the availability of resources. And when I say resources, I mean both financial resources and I mean personnel resources and the people as well as the availability of things of tools for them to use. And in my situation, things really narrowed down for a pretty healthy period of time here, especially during early 2020 and through that first year of the pandemic, where I was kind of doing a lot of what was available by myself and had to learn a lot of new techniques, a lot of new options, a lot of new things on the fly. And I think that pressure was on a lot of people, and some people were better suited for it than others, some folks in
Hmm.
ministry and some
Yeah.
congregations. So yeah, definitely I would say the smaller congregations probably had that a little harder.
What do you think the larger churches, how would they have felt it differently than maybe a small church? And I know you're not in a larger church. I just wondered what your opinion is, having because you're a pretty analytical guy, and what do you think about the larger churches? What did they suffer and had to deal with that maybe the small churches didn't?
I wonder if their in-person activity was maybe the most apparent. Well, what's the word I'm looking for? Was the thing that was impacted perhaps the hardest? At least,
Casualty.
yeah, at least here in Iowa and around the country, really. In the early days, pretty much everything shut down. We had the essential things that were still happening, but a lot of things just kind of went on hold, and that included churches, and that included a lot of different types of organizations, and so perhaps those larger congregations that maybe already had a very active, engaged online presence, because some congregations or some churches had that ahead of time. Maybe they would have seen a large shift that direction. And while us little guys were struggling to try and set all that up, maybe they already had that going on. But then you also get into the idea of limits on crowd size and distance and how many people can be available. And so maybe they have these great big huge facilities that were barely getting utilized, and so you begin to run into the logistics of that kind of budgetary administration type stuff. And wow, where am I going with this? I don't even know where I'm going with this, but
No, but I mean, you're hitting those things that large churches had to deal with. For us, we're not real large. We're a church of about 500,
mhm.
but we had a big enough room that we could keep our multiple services and put a cap on the size of the number of people that showed up and have a lot of room for people to spread out. So what we previously felt was a detriment. There was like this big room that we had to try to fill. All of a sudden it was really nice. You felt very safe walking in, and you had some chairs for your family here, and there weren't any other chairs within 6 feet. And I think 2020, there were a lot of resources being thrown around. by church people as well as the government and the states. And people weren't really feeling the resource pinch. And I don't think a lot of churches were in 2020. But as things went on and you got into 2021 and things started to dry up, people started to, decide where they were going to land or not land. I think that the churches that experienced difficulty, 2021 was almost a rougher year in that way for people in terms of volunteerism and people hours and people resources, human resources, as well as finances. But I'll let you get the last word on this topic, and then we're moving right on from this topic. If you got anything to add about it.
Well, I think you really kind of nailed it there when as you talked about uh, 2020 versus 21. 20 was really the year of the pandemic when, at least here in our corner of the country, things really kind of came to a grinding halt, and we had to do things completely new and so out of the ordinary. And then as things kind of cooled off through 21, then it was trying to find what's the new normal, and how close can we get to pre-pandemic normal, and can we work our way back to that. And in a lot of ways, at least here in Underwood, we got pretty close. Where our in-person attendance is about 75% of what it had been. And but For the most part, things feel fairly normal. But of course, we're all listening to the news and trying to pay attention to keep people safe, and yet the resources are out there for folks to be they can be vaccinated and they can wear masks, and we can all do that to try and care for each other.
Yeah.
So we see that sense of normalcy returning, but at the same time, the bumps of finding, okay, well, this we're not going to resume that type of thing's not going to happen, and getting everyone on that same page has been a struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really been crazy. I have watched and listened to as little news as I ever have in my life, probably in the last 6 months, just because it is unhealthy for my heart and my brain and my personal interactions. So I just haven't. We could talk all day about that, but again, man, I don't want to hear about that stuff so much anymore. But I was curious with you, and you and I caught up a little bit on that before we pushed record. But last week, I talked about a research study that was done on the needs of pastors. And we talked last week about this need for more and more consistent personal prayer. And if you want to know what I said about that, you'd have to go back to season 3, episode 1. But I have some definite thoughts about that. I think that there's too much guilt going on by believers who've been forgiven in Christ, and I'll just leave it at that. But this week, I wanted to talk to you about these other two personal needs that pastors listed as the greatest personal needs after prayer. Was the first one was friendships and fellowship with others, and the second one was relationships with other pastors. So these were the top listed things, personal things. The pastors say, yeah, I really need better friendships. I really need more fellowship with others. I really need deeper and closer relationships with other pastors. And as you and I talked about that, you said what, Scott?
Well, I said that, interestingly enough, is not really a concern for me personally. I feel very, very blessed and very fortunate to have a really great colleague group that I am a part of, with almost entirely pastors that are part of my denomination. We do have a few folks that kind of trickle in that are from different denominational backgrounds, which is great. We always appreciate their different insight that they bring. But I've been very, very fortunate, from almost the first instant I came to Underwood. Within about the first 2 weeks, I started to reach out to some of the other local ELCA pastors, and I thought, we'll keep it on brand to start with, as I started to make connections, and found this group, and was very, very fortunate to have one fellow pastor. He's still in the same congregation where he was at that time when I started, and he's very intentional about extending those invitations and bringing new folks into that group. And I think we all recognize the ease to just stay in your office, to just kind of burrow yourself in, and maybe you justify it by saying, oh, I've got so much reading to do, or I've got so much writing to do, and I've got to get preparation done for the weekend, and I have this class to get ready. And so we just kind of hunker down. And and maybe we do it without realizing it, or maybe we do it intentionally, but I think that temptation is always there. Admittedly, during 2020, I kind of fell in that trap when we were all supposed to stay home. I stayed in my office a lot, but now as we've kind of moved back into a sense of normalcy, I've gotten back in with that colleague group, and it's just a wonderful thing. You know, we do community ministry together. We do services together. In fact, just about a month ago, the group of us did a service together right before Christmas, and it's just a wonderful way to be with like-minded people and who understand the pressures and the stress that come with working in ministry. You know, all careers have their stress, and I don't want to say that pastors have the corner market on that, but
Sure. Yeah.
to have that those types of people who understand the same things that you do is just a wonderful thing, and I think a very important aspect of thriving in ministry is having like-minded folks that you interact with.
So let me ask you, what as assessments go, what kind of a personality have you assessed with? What comes out when you go through an assessment? Are you introvert, extrovert? Where are you at?
I have always considered myself an extrovert, and when I have done that particular test, which is at the Myers Briggs, I forget what that one's
Oh,
called,
there's all kinds of them now. So
but that one reads me as being extroverted, but at the same time, as I've been in ministry longer, maybe it's being in ministry, maybe it's just that I've gone from being young to now being middle aged, that I'm not as extroverted as I used to be. I definitely have some more introverted tendencies. In fact, today is Tuesday as we're recording this. Yesterday was Monday. Monday is my day off, and I want everyone to just go away and let me hide in my cave and recharge that way. But
yeah.
I do still enjoy interactions with people. I think the extrovert is definitely still there once I get recharged, and to be able to do that with whether it's colleagues or whether it's people in the community or people from the congregation. I do just enjoy people and spending that time with them.
So you're connected with pastors who are within your denomination, and they meet. You said they meet weekly or monthly?
We do. We do. We typically meet weekly. We
Okay.
have the group that we center around. It's called a text study. You know, the very first time I was on an episode, you and I talked about the lectionary,
The
which
lectionary,
dictates.
yeah.
Yep, which dictates the scripture passages that that I will focus on and that I will preach on for the weekend. And all of our congregations follow that same lectionary, so we
Is
all
it a
come
2 year
together.
or 3 year?
It's a 3 year one. There's also a 4 year one, but I've never played around with that one. I've just stuck
So
with this
you're so
one.
you're in your third. You're in your third go around of
I am in
this,
my third lap now. Yes, through the lectionary. So
and they're the same scriptures
there are the
each
same script.
cycle.
Yep, each cycle they're the same. Now there are four assigned passages every week. That's what's
Okay.
usually an Old Testament, usually like one of the epistles, an assigned psalm, and then an assigned gospel text. You know that gets mixed up every once in a while, but that's basically the breakdown. And
And
every
they're
3 years,
connected.
yep, they're connected. There's usually a theme that runs through them, and then every 3 years the whole process starts over, and we're back to the same text again.
So I heard this, and I think it's so true because I've experienced so many different times. You go back to the same text, but 3 years later, you're different,
Yes.
and that text flows through you differently.
Yes.
and you teach it differently. You've maybe learned some things about that
Hmm.
in the past 3 years. And do you feel like, do you have any sense at all? Because actually, I'm a little more knowledgeable on the lectionary and this whole idea of having liturgy and having a plan and having a church year. And what do they call it? What's the term for, going through the year with all the different themes? Is there a term for that?
Well, I call it the liturgical calendar. Uh,
Okay, the liturgical calendar.
yep.
There is a method behind the madness, right?
Mhm.
There's a very definite purpose of taking people through the experience of Scripture and through the significant events, similar to in the Old Testament when God had all the special days and weeks and
Mhm.
festivals and feasts to remind people
Yep.
of the things that are important, and that's what the liturgical year does, and the liturgical calendar does.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I've learned a little bit about that. But have you ever even had the sense that, oh man, I we just went over this 3 years ago, and I'm not that excited about it? I mean, honestly, have you ever like approached it and like, I don't really want to do this again?
Yes, with a fair bit of regularity, actually.
Oh,
Um,
really?
and
Really?
which that's why I appreciate that there are four different assigned passages every week, because there are times when I look, predominantly I preach from the gospel. Whatever the assigned gospel text is, that's the one I stick with. But every once in a while I'll read that and I'm like, you know what? Either because of current events or because of my
Uh,
own sensibility or things that are going on within the community or whatever, I'm like, that just doesn't work. And maybe the Holy Spirit is shoving me in the direction of one of the other passages. And full disclosure, that's happening this week. As Yeah, we didn't plan this, folks. We did not plan this. This is happening. This is a Holy
reprobate.
Spirit moment. Johnny would be so happy he would make a sign of a halo over his head or something. I don't know, but what's interesting about the assigned gospel text this week, it picks up directly where last Sunday's left off, and it's Jesus' first time preaching in his home synagogue when he
Hmm.
reads from the prophet Isaiah, and everything he reads sounds really great. And everybody in his home congregation, in his home synagogue, is like, "This is so wonderful. This is great." And then he kind of turns the tables, and they get really mad at him. And and last week, knowing what follows in the larger story, I kind of went into that already, and I thought people don't need to hear that 2 weeks in a row. And also, this Sunday happens to be the annual meeting of my congregation when we do our annual business meeting. And it's so happy and joyful and
So John
wonderful.
13. John 13 is where we need to go then.
Well, maybe, but what I'm actually going with, one of the other assigned texts, is 1 Corinthians 13,
Oh,
prominently
beautiful.
featured in so many weddings. Love is patient, love is
Yeah.
kind. And, sometimes, even though we're a faith community, sometimes we butt heads with each other, and we need to remember that we love each other too.
Absolutely. Well, Johnny and I have talked about that for years. I don't even think of First Corinthians 13 anymore as a wedding chapter. Like now that you mentioned, I haven't really thought about this, but I haven't thought about it in that way in a number of years now because it is such a powerful chapter on what Jesus talks about in John 13, what Matthew talks about, Jesus talks about in Matthew 22, and what Paul talks about in Romans 13. I think it's what, 9 through 13, something like that, 10 through 12, whatever it is. Love. And John 13, love. And it's like the first thing that believers jettison out the window when something goes wrong. And it's the only command that Jesus says, hey, this is the command that I want you to keep. So, 1 Corinthians 13, beautiful, perfect. You ought to have people have to, in order to get in to the annual business meeting, you have to recite like 8 verses from 1 Corinthians 13, the first 8 or 10 verses, or else you don't get in.
I might have
Uh,
to give him a cheat sheet though. We have to have a quorum, and if we don't have enough people, we can't do the business, which means we have to reschedule it. So we
hey,
want to
hey,
set the bar low.
I gotta tell you good news. Good news. In my church, you know what the quorum is? Whoever shows up. Oh, it's so beautiful. So
I need to
beautiful.
do a
So
constitutional amendment that will allow it to be that way here.
and I don't know if that's a Christian Missionary Alliance a uniform constitution piece, or if that's just our own customized bylaws. Off the top of my head right now, I don't know, but I love that. I love that. So let's get back to you, Scott. Why you are not lonely? You've got this group of people that are in your Lutheran group. Do you have other pastors or other close friends that you connect with who aren't a part of that? What other
I
groups are you
I
connected
do.
with?
Now there's one other congregation here within my community. It's a small community of Christ Church, and there's a minister that helps guide that. Interestingly enough, um, her daughter lives right across the street from me, so I see her with a fair bit of regularity. And it's a town of 1,000 people, so I'm going to see her anyway. But we have worked together on in certain things, like we do oftentimes the spring senior baccalaureate at the high school. We've worked on that together, and there's also there's a Catholic priest that lives one community over. You know, he lives 7 minutes away, and he and I will get together and communicate on things. So I'm connected with a number of ministry folks. I'm also fortunate that my wife is in ministry and brings that insight into our conversation. So that's a blessing as well. And yet I also have friend groups that are outside of ministry that have no connection to ministry whatsoever. And I think that's important as well, that we don't just stick our proverbial head in the sand of being surrounded by only people who think the same way I do or do the same type of thing I do. Now, that's a good thing to have, but it's also good to have the perspective and the friendship and the connection with folks who have nothing to do with the church, whether they have, well, boy, where am I going with that? I think it's good to be connected with people, whether they have their own faith life or not, because that's the world that we're a part of. And how
Yeah.
can we minister to the world if we're ignoring it?
You sound like some kind of a radical though, because you're pushing everybody's buttons. You're talking about like a woman preacher, then you're talking about fellowship with a Catholic priest, then you're talking about how your wife is in ministry, so she's probably some kind of a pastor or something. And so I just want to remind our listeners that this podcast is for pastors and spiritual leaders of congregations. And it doesn't matter what denomination, and it doesn't matter what gender, because we could my grandson, when his little sister was born, I remember being in the hospital room, and my daughter-in-law was in the bed, and she was holding the little baby, right, the little baby sister, and my grandson knocks. He comes in, and he was all of like 2 years and maybe a month or two old, and he looked over and he saw this little pound of flesh in my daughter-in-law's hands, and he just squeezed his eyes shut, and he just kind of walked the other way with his eyes just squeezed shut. And he just thought if he would squeeze his eyes shut enough, they wouldn't be she wouldn't be there and she would be disappeared. And every time they tried to show his little sister to him, he would just squeeze his eyes shut. And sometimes I think that some of us religious leaders are like that. If somebody's doing something that's different than we would do, or something we don't think people should do, we just squeeze our eyes shut and hope that it doesn't exist. But there are a lot of women pastors in the United States and around the world. And there are a lot of Catholic priests. There's just a lot of spiritual leaders. We want to speak into their lives on our podcast. We want to encourage them, and we'll let God decide where I'm wrong and what issues I have. Because really, we look in the mirror, that's the person who's got the issues. And we just have to take care of, what did Jesus say, right? The two by four in our own eye. and
Mhm.
not worry about other people. So I have gotten to know people that lead all kinds of different denominations. I used to have one a long time ago that I would always cite. I think it was a female rabbi in New Hampshire, and she had written a note to us that was so kind and so encouraging. And I think she was telling me at the time, this was a long time ago now, this was in 2014 when my son was in a terrible accident, that her congregation, her synagogue, was saying prayers for my son's health. And that just, if you know me, it just it got me right there. And I was so thankful. And it was such a loving thing for her to do, to reach out like that. So, Scott, you talked about women pastors and Catholic priests, and I wanted to affirm that and just say that as a podcast, we want to give ministry encouragement to ministry leaders. Uh, so tell me more about this text group. Is this only on Zoom, or do you actually get together in person? And how does everybody have input, and how much time do you spend going over the texts for the week?
Well, we predominantly we do meet in person. We kind of played around with trying to meet on Zoom, back there in the early days of 2020, when connection was just really difficult. But um, this is a group, at least from my experience, that works best in person. And that's not to disparage online work or online connection. But there are certain things where that online works better, and there are certain things where in person works better. Which tangent, I think, is an important lesson for us to learn within ministry, that it's not one or the other, that they are both tools that are important for us to connect with in both ways. Okay, I'll jump back down off that soapbox now. But this group meets in person. Um, we usually are meeting for roughly an hour to an hour and a half, and where we're engaging with the text and talking about it. And we all kind of bring our own unique perspectives and our own unique knowledge and experience and situations from within our own congregations that we're dealing
Do you
with.
think that you help each other produce a better product on the weekend at each of your churches for the most part?
I believe so. Yes, I know that it is always helpful for me, and it enlightens thoughts and perspectives that I hadn't even considered, as I go into the text, and I think that's important for us. Um, as the farther I've gotten into ministry, as I've gotten farther and farther away from my start date back in 2013, is that I tend to fall into the trap that I think a lot of ministry people do, where we're thinking about this stuff a lot. We're thinking about this stuff all the time. We're
Hmm.
engaging with the scripture to get ready for that message, or to get ready for the class that we're going to teach, or the conversations that we're going to have. But not everybody's always doing that. So this group helps me to turn the Scott brain off and to start hearing this text or reading this text through the eyes of another person. And I think that's so vital. That we always talk about how the body of Christ is one body with many members,
Hmm.
many perspectives, many experiences, many situations. Even like you were talking a moment ago with different denominations and different faith organizations, and all of these things kind of apply the same way. So that group is wonderful, both from a collegiality standpoint and also from a gaining insight into a message that I'm trying to prepare, to hopefully give a word of good news to the congregation that I'm preaching to.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. So, Scott, we talked earlier about your connection to Johnny and I. Obviously, it's through the podcast. When did you say you started in 2013?
I started
What
in
month?
July, so a
In
few months
July.
after you guys had started.
Okay. Yeah, so it's I think we started the podcast just for you, so that we would be up and running when you got to your church. And you started listening to us, what, your first year maybe
Pretty
in
early on.
ministry?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it was probably, I'm trying to remember back. I think you and I have talked about this before. It was probably sometime in about 2014 that I stumbled across the podcast somehow and
Okay.
realized, oh, these guys are only like 2 hours away from me. They're actually pretty
Yeah.
close, and started listening. And I think you did. I think you started it just for me knowing that one day Johnny would not be available and that you would have to call me in.
Scott, this is your day.
This
This
is
is
that
it.
day.
How lucky you are. You are filling the Johnny Craig chair of podcasting. Hey, I just drove by your place because when I left Omaha the other day, I came across on 80, right? I usually go up and I take 880 and go around the north side, but this time I came down below, and so went right past Underwood and thought about you, and was what my face was set like a flint to the east, and I just had to keep the pedal down. But you're one of the people that we never would have met had we not started a podcast. And honestly, it's been good these past 8 months to not think about spending 3, 4, 5, 6 hours every week on a podcast. But I have really missed the connection with other people. So I just want to say to our listeners, I don't know what it is that you do, or maybe you did, that connected you with other pastors or friends, that somehow we got cocooned, right, in 2020, and maybe we haven't fully jumped out of it. Because you said earlier, well, we've got books to read, we've got, sermons to prepare for, we've got, hey, that is true. Honestly, truth, the list is endless. I mean, I was talking to an elder today and I said, I need to put a list together of all the people that you elders need to call and visit because I can't get to them all. And they're not being gotten to right now. And we really need to focus in on that. So, to our listeners, pay attention to your relational health with other people and to your relational time and with who you're spending your time with. We all hear it, but we get busy, we get distracted, and we get cocooned in our office or in our home. And we all know that relationships are important, and spending time refilling our tanks is important. My friend Rob from Philadelphia called me this afternoon, and we talked for about a half an hour. If anybody's listened to me on this podcast for any amount of time, they'll know who Rob is. Rob is episode 38 and 39, way back in 2013. He and I were college roommates. He called me. I answered the phone as I was closing my office door. And here's how I answer it when he calls: Yo. And he says, Yo, what's up? And I mean, it's like we're right back in the dorm upon saying hello. But then after that, everything's pretty serious because we've got stuff going on. But so good to talk to somebody that I lived with when I was 19 years old, almost 40 years ago now. And so I just want to encourage pastors. I want to encourage you. Um, Find other pastors that you can spend some time with. And Scott, give a word of encouragement on how to push yourself when you adopt this introverted approach and you get kind of locked in. How can they give them something practical? How can they like get themselves out there just to make a connection that's going to be health giving?
The first thought that came to mind is something that I picked up as I've read and explored apps. And this is dumb. This doesn't sound like it should apply, but I think it does. One of the keys to making something uh, maybe not popular, but to keep people engaged is called gamify. Somehow make a game out of it. And that's
Hmm.
what keeps people coming back, especially when their ad revenue is because you're clicking on things on your app. But I bring this up, maybe you need to set yourself a goal of this week. I'm going to make 5 phone calls uh, to people who work in other area churches, and you put the lists up on your whiteboard, and you've got your 5 things that are just waiting to be checked off, and you make a game out of it. And somehow just challenging yourself, finding a way to get yourself motivated to take that first step. So often that first step is the scary one, and it's easy and it's safe just to stay in the cocoon, like you called it a moment ago. But to give yourself that challenge, and then to just be curious. I think when we're meeting new people, or when we're, even if it's someone that maybe we know but we don't know very well, to be naturally curious. The world is a wonderful place. People are amazing if we just push a little bit, and dig, and are curious about them, and sometimes we find that's reciprocated as well, and new relationships form, and and it's just a wonderful thing to be in relationship with one another. All you pastors and ministry type folks out there, if you're feeling stuck, make a game out of it. Because and I want Jeff to hear from you how many of you got your 5 people called.
Yeah. Jeff at 200churches.com. That's the email address right there. Hey, I got to brag on my son for a little bit. My youngest son, Mitch, who grew up having a dad who had a pastor podcast. I mean, he's 23 now. So he was 14 when we started this project, and he's in college now. He's got another year and a half left to go. He took a break during the whole craziness, and he got married. He's in college. He's got his wife with him. But do you know that video games, speaking of gamify, video games are now like actual sports at some colleges? And he is on the varsity team at his college. And he writes back to me and he says, Dad, this is something I used to dream about back when I was a freshman and sophomore in high school, that I could be like on a video game team in college. And I'm like, really? Like, I didn't even know there was such a thing. So, anyway, gamify. Yeah, it's like his college experience all of a sudden, and he's computers and networking and all that, so he's actually able to have a lot of fun there too. Hey, Scott, if Johnny's not available and I have a guest that I need to interview, would you be willing, if your schedule permitted it, to sit in the Johnny Craig chair of podcasting to help me interview a guest?
Absolutely. I would be honored and delighted, and may even text Johnny just to give him a little bit of grief if he can't be there. But anytime, anytime.
Just to get his goat.
Yes. I think
All
he will
right.
appreciate that. Or he won't, in which case he won't respond to me.
He's fine. He's fine. Hey, for those of you who know Johnny, he is in Waterloo, Iowa, in a 3-story home, 5,000 square feet. This old mansion with a beautiful family with 4 kids. And he's busy renovating, spending time with the family, pastoring a digital congregation that's all around the central Iowa area, and then traveling 2 hours to his church to preach in person about once a month. So he's a busy guy, and we will definitely we'll hear from him pretty quick. But I wanted to get this thing going. I wanted to get this show back on the road. So Scott, thanks for joining me today, and we'll have you on again very soon. And we'll catch you on the next episode of the 200 Churches podcast. did did your let's see, pause? Nope, stop.